Thank you so much, Naila. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, the stage is set. There's nothing more for me to say or do other than to hand over to the moderator of the panel that will now build on this foundation. I don't want to spend an hour speaking about Gerry, so I'm just going to say two things. The one is that he is said to be the brainchild or the brain behind the formation of Trust Africa, and was actually served as the founding chairperson of the Trust Africa board. His credentials are way too long, but I will mention one other thing, that of course is the 2023 Lifetime Achievement recipient, of course, of the Africa Philanthropy Conference. Let's please welcome Gerry Salole to the stage.
While the panelists come up to the top here and sit up here, if you don't mind, Benjamin, Ewelina. I want us to just pause for a minute before we start this conversation to acknowledge the gentleness, and I didn't think I'd use that word, the gentleness that Naira delivered a very powerful message to us, because she restrained herself enormously to say important things, and I hope that in the spirit of that, this audience will also want to talk to these issues. And I find this conference particularly fitting for this kind of conversation because it has a tradition. This is the 5th time we meet, but it has a tradition of speaking truth to ourselves. This is less backslapping, patting yourself on the back kind of conference in philanthropy than I normally go to, where we are interrogating whether what we do is adequate and proper. And I'm going to come to you, Ewelina, first. My job is a traffic cop. I have no framing to do. But Ewelina, why don't you tell us a little bit about, I think, one of the paradoxes that Naila talked about, which is the hypocrisy, if I excuse my word, the difference of standards when you're dealing with one context and then dealing with another. And this is something that I know that Africa-Europe Foundation has been working on. So please, maybe we could just go over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Gerry. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's very good to be here. I would like to thank Becky, Brima, Gerry for having me here. And thank you, Naila, for this wonderful speech. And so very happy to be here and to share some thoughts. I would say that, the kind of the gap between a little bit the discourse and the action, we saw a lot of this in the recent months and years. And so I work for the Africa-Europe Foundation, and our role is really very much to work on the kind of global stage, global policies to kind of strengthen the Africa-Europe partnership. So obviously, who says Africa-Europe partnership speaks a lot about very complex and sometimes contentious topics that we are not afraid to address, but also trying to see some kind of potential wins. But I think even with philanthropy, I think we saw this kind of gap between the discourse and the practice in so many ways. And I think, as we said, we've been speaking about, decolonizing philanthropy, about the trust-based philanthropy, about the flexible funding for so many years. But I think some of the recent research by the OECD, but by many others, shows that there is a huge gap between what has been said and what has been actually done. So I think this is definitely something that needs to be addressed. And then about those kind of global issues and global discussions, I think the question that I have is, what was also the response from the Global South to Naila, just to see, what type of response you got? Because sometimes what I'm wondering, and we can speak about it later on, about how philanthropy participates in those global policy discussion, is whether the Global South actually if there's a space for them, if this is attractive to participate in the discussion, but whether there's an interest as well, where they do feel that they want to take kind of part in those discussions. So this is something I also like to maybe discuss later on. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this whole issue of what one does in a context where there are different standards being held, I think Naila asked us a very important question about what do we do in that context, and do we call it out, and do we have the guts to actually say this is not normal? And I'm wondering, Priscilla, I'm coming to you. Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry you're not with us, but Priscilla,
oh, me too.
Maybe you would like to share your thoughts about what Naila had to say.
Sure, thank you so much, and also thanks for having me online. I hope you can hear me, and it's really great to be here with you, albeit virtually. And thanks, Naila, for the very powerful speech. I think it was really very interesting, especially because it's not very often, as also Ewelina was saying, that we have the opportunity to hear from different voices. So I think it's really important that we have all of these different perspectives. From my vantage point, and looking at the research that the OECD Center on Philanthropy has been conducting for years, it's really clear that there have been a lot of statements made to shift the power, to give more agency to global South actors and to partners in what is now being called the global majority by many foundations. But actually what we observe in a report we recently published is that only 19% of private philanthropy for development financing goes towards organizations through flexible funding mechanisms, so providing core support with what we would call no strings attached. If you think about it, this is really, really a small proportion in light of the recent statements about the donors wanting to go more towards locally led development, giving more voice to the local organizations and so forth. So I think there is really a big reflection that needs to be made by foundations in terms of what do we mean and how do we act when we talk about locally led development, giving agency to local actors and putting the decision-making in their hands. I think this is really something we want to work more on at the OECD network of foundations working for development, but also at the Center on Philanthropy. So I think it's also a bit in the same vein of what Ewelina was saying. I think it's really important to also bring actors from the global majority, global South, you can call it what you prefer, in these conversations, really asking them, what do we need to do better? How can we really change the way in which we work? Is it about developing a strategy for locally led development involving you? Is this about funding? Is this about bringing you into global policy fora, giving you our voice? As Naila also said, I mean, I think one powerful sentence she used is using our privilege to empower peers in the global South. I think that's exactly what foundations need to do more and more. So these are just some initial thoughts, and I'm really curious to hear also from the room what is their experience when working with international foundations, when partnering with international foundations in terms of really having the power to make decisions about the funding, but also about the programs and about how the money, the financial and non-financial support is used.
Thank you, Priscilla. Thank you, Priscilla. That's a good way to start. I'm going to now come to you, Marlon. Please, can you tell us what your reaction to this comment is, and maybe contextualize it, given that you're on the ground and you're working in this kind of context all the time?
Good afternoon, Gerry, and thank you very much for the welcome. First of all, let me also acknowledge and thank the organizers of the conference and to express our gratitude for being invited to this forum. As I mentioned, I wear several identities, and I also like to identify with the main speaker and the keynote about multiple identities, hopefully not bringing necessarily contradictions. And so today I come to represent the head of the project that I work for, Robson Chakwana, who is the head of the GIZ Strengthening National Regional Linkages in the Southern African Development Community SADC project. And as colleagues may know, GIZ is a public enterprise that is implementing German development cooperation. And the project that I work for is particularly focused on the region of Southern Africa, but perhaps even the work and the experiences and insights that we have could be applicable to the other regions in our continent. I'd like to particularly thank Naila for the thought-provoking keynote speech, but also stand on the keynote speech that was also given yesterday. I think today Dr. Ibrima mentioned that the beauty of the Philanthropy Conference, the African Philanthropy Conference, is that there is no hierarchy. And so I was privileged to be part of the academic conference, and I love to see the seamless fusion from Sunday to today. And yesterday, Dr. Godwin Murunga talked about international development cooperation being on its deathbed. And I think in the work that we are doing as GIZ in SADC, we have also seen that there is a great challenge and stress on international development cooperation. But at the same time, given some of the tragedies that we are encountering in all parts of the world, we are also seeing that international cooperation remains indispensable. And so this is part of the work that we try and do in the work that we do on the ground. Naila mentioned about doing simple things together. I think that's something that's extremely powerful and profound. How can we do this? How can we support knowledge generation? How can we support centers of excellence, making sure that policies that transform the lives of our citizens in the SADC region, in ECOWAS, in EAC, in Central Africa are informed by the centers of excellence that we have on the continent, not least the Wits Business School and others that we have on the continent. Number two, how can we support philanthropy, African philanthropy, to occupy the space that is opening up because of the retreat of traditional development cooperation? And that's something that we're experiencing as we work with many SADC governments, acknowledging the potential and promise of African philanthropy. Some time ago, I was with the Southern Africa Trust, and as far back as 2018, a research that we did for SADC found that African philanthropy has the potential to generate about $1.25 billion to support innovative financing of long-term development projects in SADC that remains uncovered. And so there are all these promises and space that African philanthropy can move ahead and occupy to support identification of innovative options for financing development, moving from responding to crisis to being a partner, a formidable partner for long-term development. So I think perhaps as a starting point, Gerry, this is some of the insights that we found that I'd like to share. Thank you so much.
Yes.
I'm not introducing panelists because you have their bios, so please, I don't want to take time on that. Ben.
Okay. Well, I think as my colleagues, I would like to start by thanking and acknowledging the courage and the strength of Naila, who has made like a very important speech, also has written important pieces recently, which we'll all read, questioning some of the comfort zones of the philanthropic sector that we're all part of and we all have a play in. So thanks Naila for your words. I think one of the things that resonated with me in what Naila said was the idea to decolonize ourselves first. Of course, decolonizing institutions, decolonizing, organizations and the way we work, but it starts with the way we see the world, with our worldview. And this reminded me of a conversation I had a while ago with an author called Edgar Villanueva that some of you might know. He has written about decolonized wealth. And he's from an indigenous background, and he's really encouraging philanthropy to use money as a healing mechanism and to use money to the philanthropic capital to do reparations and to also diversify their boards, etc., etc. So he has a number of recommendations of that sort. And in our conversation, I told him, everything you suggest sounds good to me, like that sounds good, but I'm not sure that once we've done that, we have decolonized philanthropy. I don't think once we've sent reparations or diversified the boards, I think we've made some good steps, but I don't think we've diversified, we've decolonized philanthropy until we reach to the point where we changed our worldview about what philanthropy is trying to build. Is it a society and an economic architecture and a governance models that goes against all the values of indigenous people? So if yes, then you haven't decolonized it at all. You have made some changes. So I think that's what the sector needs to think about in the context of the global polycrisis, with the climate emergency, with the inequalities and the geopolitical shifts and the wars and all of that, and also the sort of exponential disruptive technologies that nobody is really talking about in democratic terms. With this context, I think the philanthropic sector, the first thing I would say is that we need to think about what is our worldview, what is the kind of society we're trying to build, because then we'll be able to say, yes, we've actually decolonized our thinking. We're not just trying to redo more of the same, but in better and help others follow the same models as we've had in the West, let's say, for the past decades and centuries, but we're actually helping to build something new that does not exist yet, and that is aligned with the values of our communities, our people, our traditions, and all of that. So that's something I think we need to work on, and that's the bravest thing philanthropy, I think, can do, is to ask these questions and respond to them.
Thank you, Benjamin. So I'm now looking at this audience. I want to bring you in as quickly as I can, so I need to get some sense if you have comments you want to make. But we'll go for another round. I don't know if you noticed, but they have already been very subversive, because they've given Naila a microphone. So at any point, Naila could come right back in here. So I was hoping she would listen patiently to all the wonderful things we were saying, and then would give us feedback. But now that you have a mic, Naila, do you want to say anything at this point? No. I don't mean to discourage you from saying anything. Any comments at this stage? So I'd like to come back to this whole issue of a list of small things we could do differently, because it's essentially about how do we behave differently, and how can we begin to behave differently. I think everybody seems to be saying that's important. And yet, as an industry, we keep doing the same thing again and again and again and again. We use the same words, we use them lightly, and when there's a problematic issue, we pretend it hasn't happened, essentially. And the question really is, how do we do things differently? What can we do? And I thought that list that Naila gave us of small things we could do, pledging things to each other, promising to behave in a different way, holding each other's feet to the fire. And it's something that I encourage the Africa-Europe Foundation to do a lot, which is to hold both the African Union and the European Union to account for promises they make that nobody checks up on, which is what now the Africa-Europe Foundation is beginning to do. But could we talk a little bit about how we can begin to behave differently? And I'm coming back to you, Ewelina. We could start with you again.
Yes, thank you so much. So I agree, when you think about, how foundations can actually kind of react to this global changing order, it's a little bit seems as a daunting task, right? How can, from where we stand, we can kind of influence a little bit of this. So I've had a few kind of ideas that stand out, but maybe we'll start just by one saying, there is such a big compromise on the fact that philanthropy from the, let's say, global south, the first thing first needs to just unlearn definitely everything we kind of, took from maybe the Northern foundations and the models, so that's for sure. However, something I haven't heard much about, and I think something it's for me seems important, is while we unlearn about different kind of ways of the grant making, accountability, we shouldn't forget that still maybe there's one thing that we should make sure we do good while we do good, is the accountability. Because whether north or south, foundations are accountable, but they are mainly accountable to the people they serve. And for me, this is something I think that is really important. So while we are reinventing the models for the African philanthropy, the way we give, let's make sure that we learn from it, that we document what we learn, that we showcase, because actually we can also do harm. And I just don't want us to forget this, that, you know, there's this responsibility in taking those new models, new ways of giving, and you know, at the end we serve the people, right? So I think this is something Philanthropy from the North is not doing great. I mean, again, there was many studies showing that there's a lot of accountability downstream. So foundations from the North ask a lot of evaluations from their grantees, but not doing a lot of evaluations of their own kind of activities. So this is something I like foundations from the South will also show the way of, you know, okay, we're doing this differently. There are those new different models, but we should definitely also show their kind of how they work, you know, how is this working and what we can learn from it. So let's also not forget about this. And then something else I think for me is, again, this advocacy. I think the notion of advocacy. You know, when we speak about influencing the global kind of, you know, political agenda, I think, you know, advocacy is so unused as a way of working for foundations, and I mean advocacy as opposed to, let's say, programmatic giving, right? While it has such a multiplier effect, it can have such a huge kind of impact on many things. So beyond declarations, beyond the money giving to grants, I think advocacy is such a great way to kind of for foundations to kind of tune in to the global governance. And when I speak about advocacy, there's so many ways kind of you can work. You can work obviously on and it's also because obviously foundations themselves, we said we don't work in a vacuum. We need to work with the policymakers. But I wanted to say advocacy is both working with formal policy, so trying to take a seat at the table, at the global policy table. And I think when I started 10 years ago, there were very few opportunities from foundations from the global south to take a seat at the global policy table. This has evolved a little bit today. There are a little bit more opportunities for foundations, for philanthropy as a sector, to take part in some of those discussions. But the question is whether foundations from the south claim this seat. Wings is facilitating quite a few of those kind of opportunities, NetForward as well. I mean, I think there are opportunities out there. G20 created ways for foundations to weigh in, but you need to claim this seat, and this is possible. So this is one. But then you can work with policymakers, whether on documenting the effects of the policies of disasters. You can document, you can kind of do some policy here. You can also fund showing what are the alternatives model, right? So funding research. And then also you can hold policymakers accountable, and many foundations are doing great work here, and Gerry just mentioned Africa Euro Foundation is doing this. So just this example for African Union and European Union, there's Africa Euro Partnership, and it's been there for 20 years, and there's been so many political declarations and promises made on, who is doing what, but guess what? For 20 years, there was no single follow-up on those promises, whether political or financial. So, for example, our foundations, which is relatively small, took that role and filled that gap and is now doing the kind of annual monitoring of where do we stand on those promises. We started with the 6th summit that took place in 2022. And so this is the kind of, advocacy work that you can do to hold policymakers accountable. And last point, but I'll finish with this. But advocacy is also working with informal norms. So this is not only formal policies, but also informal rules, social norms and structures. And here you can work with, educate the public. There is so much also to be done here, because I think, if you don't address both formal, sometimes policies, but also informal behavior, social norms, I think this is also not really effective. So I think advocacy for me is such a kind of unexplored still, I feel, kind of way of working for foundations that can kind of help them kind of participate in this global policy debate and hope to shape it as well.
Thank you. Priscilla, before I come to you, I don't know if you've seen, there's been an article that was produced this week by Barry Knight in Alliance, which was a reaction to Naila's speech, I guess, at the Wings conference. In Nairobi, and it's a very powerful article. But essentially what Barry is saying in the article is that we're complicit, that those of us that are in this business are complicit with some of the things that we are seeing. And he took this really from, I guess, a speech you made, Naila. My instinct is to say to Priscilla, do we have any way of holding ourselves accountable for our own obsession, really, with always looking at the positive that our industry does and not being direct enough about the things we're not doing well. How good are we at self-evaluation?
So thanks for this question, Gerry. And you know very well where I'm coming from, because in my previous life before the OECD, I was working at Impact Europe, and we were really, even in my work there, pushing foundations, impact investors, you name it, to be more transparent about the positive and the negative impacts they would create. And I think we are not really close to cracking that nut, let's say. So I think what you are mentioning is absolutely true. We are much, much better at focusing on the positives than really recognizing the sort of challenges that we face. And I think this goes back to the point that Ewelina made about accountability. You know, we have as a sector to become more transparent in terms of the objectives that we have, but also expose the results we have achieved, whether they're positive or they're negative, and also be more transparent on how we fail and how we learn from failures. And if you remember, Gerry, you were still CEO of the European Foundation Center when at Impact Europe, back then EVPA, we published that report on learning from failures in venture philanthropy. I think it was 2015 probably. And we were so proud because we had a list of ways in which foundations had failed and foundations admitting their failures. But looking back, I think we could probably today, almost 10 years later, produce the same report and have the same learnings and have the same list of things. And I don't think the issue is more how you act on the recognition of your failures, right? And then another thing I wanted to mention is that the Development Cooperation Directorate of the OECD recently published a paper, well, it's a very long report, it's about 80 pages, on approaches that the donors, basically, so members of the development assistance committees, have found to be effective when it comes to locally led development, so shifting the power and so on and so forth. There are 5 pillars. It's about, having policy and institutional arrangement, better financing mechanisms, partnerships and collaboration mechanisms, management processes and delivery practices, and then tools to measure progress. And there are fantastic examples for the first 4 pillars, but when it comes to measuring progress or challenges, they have found basically no good example of donors having proper instruments to measure the performance of their locally led development strategy. So that's really a huge gap, where I think we don't just need to sort of push African foundations to learn how to do it, but I think we really have to unlearn the way in which we have been working in the global north or in general international foundations, and sort of face the fact that we are completely missing on that point. So definitely there is a huge work to be done in terms of being more accountable, being more transparent, and being better at measuring ex ante, during, and ex post, and also at using this to influence policymaking, but not influence in the sense of preparing a list of asks for policymakers, but more showing how foundations have the capability of producing very strong evidence that allows policymakers, other donors, development finance institutions, you name it, to work better, to work in a more efficient way, in a more effective way, to go where nobody else goes, to do the things that nobody else is doing. And together with Wings and other partners, and I'm sure Benjamin can talk a lot about this, we have engaged in different processes at the G20 level, but also at the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact that was organized here in Paris last year. We're engaging at the United Nations General Assembly to try and come with one voice for philanthropy, but not one voice in terms of the global north, but really trying to give the voice to also foundations from the global south, allowing them to bring in their evidence, the work they've been doing and what they have seen to work and what they've seen can be a game changer. Then one last point I wanted to make, I think we have to also
Priscilla,
think a little bit about, sorry.
I'm going to cut you off.
I just wanted to make one point on local intermediaries and the fact that we have to really think about how we strengthen them and take the example from the feminist funds that have been doing such fantastic work in the past years. And I think we don't talk enough about the amazing work they have really done to support foundations see how to shift the power. Sorry.
The audience, that's important. But on this issue, I'm going to come to you, Marlon. How do you feel about this word neo-colonial or decolonizing philanthropy? Is it a concept you think works, or do you actually think the emphasis is in the wrong way? I always worry that when we use the word decolonize, we're almost conceding that something had to be colonized for it to be decolonized. And I see philanthropy in Africa not being a colonial invention. So why do we have to decolonize African philanthropy? I'm just wondering, somebody working on the ground, how do you feel about that?
Thank you, Gerry. And before I go quickly, I know you said we must be quick. I should not forget my manners. I want to take the opportunity to greet Mom Michelle. We have not seen each other in a long time. And I missed part of the sessions in the morning. It's a great pleasure to see you, Mom, after such a long time. So I think, Gerry, this is where perhaps the multiple identities come through. As a student of philanthropy, but also as somebody that's working in the field, I know within GIZ broadly, there are conversations in our organization on the issues of decolonization. I can't say myself I have a very fixed opinion about the framing, but what I take from the positive aspect and from what we've worked is the encouragement of indigenous associations on our continent and in our region to take up the space that is there, to take ownership of our institutions, both at national, regional, and continental level. And if we take it that way, for me, I don't perceive of any negative connotations at all about decolonizing African philanthropy. I think we can already, and we've said it in the beginning when we started with the academic sessions, that philanthropy is part of our DNA as Africans in the first place. I think the thing that we have to change or to do more of are certain nuances, which is to be comfortable in anchoring our actions based on our own cultural positions and the assets that we have in our communities and in our societies. And that's what I would share as an encouragement. The young people are showing the way. I think we have, even within the conference, the Southern Africa Youth Forum, we have gone ahead to take up the space within the SADC to place the issues of young people forward. So for me and the vantage point that I work at, I see the value of encouraging horizontal associations that are working in the field of African philanthropy to step up with more confidence, to engage and to take the space because the issues of regional integration and development are too important, too complex to be left to governments alone. They are people's issues, and I think that there is space for everyone. There is a lot more that can be done from a perspective of trust building. And I think African philanthropy has something to show and share in terms of developing more trust, bringing critical social capital from all the various associations, from the savings groups that we were talking about, from the women's associations, from the young people's associations, to take up spaces that we traditionally leave up to executives. So I'm not sure if I met you somewhere in terms of the decolonizing bigger question, but absolutely for me, if we take that term to mean owning our agenda and owning the institutions that deliver services to our people, I think for me and the work that we do, we have a meeting point. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you, how ready do you, given that you're a worldwide movement and you are really across the globe and you have people from every one of the continents involved in Wings, how ready is this industry to follow maybe some of the things that Naila was saying, which is how ready are we to not see this as a northern-driven, northern-conceived way of working, and recognizing essentially that there is agency everywhere and people own their own kinds of philanthropy. And are we ready for the transformation that's about to hit us the hard way?
Yeah, I mean, we are ready. Doesn't mean our constituencies are all ready and in the same way and at the same pace. We recently came up with an initiative called Philanthropy's Transformation Initiative, which is the sort of synthesis or collection of the wisdom of the network, which is very broadly Global South. I mean, WING's members are quite distributed all over the world. There are more than 30, 35 here in Africa. About 45% of the membership is from the Global South, which is relatively speaking is a lot if you consider the history of the institutional philanthropy sector in different continents. And we're very, very proactive and intentional about elevating perspectives that are coming from outside the West. This is something that is critical to our members, to us, and this is also where we see oftentimes the most interesting things happening, the new ideas and innovations. And so this is critical to us. And Priscilla was referring to also the role that WINGS is now playing of being, a place where we can come up with collective voice, one unified but also collective voice for philanthropy in the global stage at the UN, at the G20, where we've managed to have the creation of a working group dedicated to philanthropy, and we hope that maybe it will turn into an engagement group in the future. We work with OECD Net Forward and many members on this. And so that is a way for us also to concretely harness the power of a network like ours to raise this voice in these spaces where we're talking about, international finance architecture reform, where we're talking about development policies, localization policies, or so-called localization policies, and so on. So this is really central, and this is what we're trying to do. And I was quickly mentioning the Philanthropy Transformation Initiative. This is where we've really tried to bring together all this thinking around, trust building and collaboration and thinking systemic and being brave and bold and all these issues that we talked about today. So they're in one place, and we're trying to work with our very diverse constituency all over the world so that, they become stronger at influencing their own members and their own constituencies so that we can accelerate change in the philanthropic sector. That is urgently needed. And one of the aspects which I think really essential in everything we've been talking about is the need for more investments from donors, including domestic donors, if we're in Africa, African donors, if we're in Asia, Asian donors, and so on, to build the ecosystem, to build the infrastructure, the support system that will enable the sector, philanthropy and giving, to grow in volumes, but also to become much more impactful. And I was glad there was a reference made to this question in the morning. I think this is absolutely essential. And if we want the so-called locally led, really truly bottom-up community, agency, etc. led, we need really strong intentional investments in this local ecosystem, especially all the community funds, the so-called intermediary funds, women's funds, social environmental funds, etc., indigenous-led funds. From what we see on a global scale is probably the most important development happening in the sector, and it needs to be very intentionally supported by international cooperation, foundations, and everyone. And I think that has the power to really shift the system.
Thank you. Very helpful. I want to just take a leaf out of my brother Ibrima's hand. He was talking earlier about the ability for African philanthropy to start thinking about alternative resources that we all need. And I think one of the ways you can do that is by breaking loose from the notion of philanthropy as being essentially private wealth and privately funded. And Grasa, if I may, in '95, I was invited together with my boss then from the Bernard Van Leer Foundation to visit a person who was sitting in Geneva who had conceived of something unheard of in a way. She wanted to see if she could create a foundation with a debt swap that the Mozambican government would hand over essentially to a community foundation in order to deal with a promise or a lack of accountability between Portugal and Mozambique. And we thought, wow, what an idea. And lo and behold, she did it. So the very first debt swap was done by Graça. This is the person who had the vision to see alternative funding as being the response. This is 95, not, you know. And the point is, we haven't made advances on this kind of work. We should really, if you look at the number of European foundations of significant scale that are funded not by private capitalist money, but by governments making resources available to philanthropy. And Naila, you and I met looking at how Italian foundations were using mafia money confiscated from the mafia, was being used in Italy to support the communities that lost out on the... And the idea that somehow we don't have enough resources. If you look at the illicit flows from this continent, there are sources of revenue we need to go after. And I think we need to lift our eyes beyond Western ideas of philanthropy and think, how do we get to those resources? And how do we get the policymakers in Africa to help us build those resources? And this is where I think things... Anyway, I'm now lecturing. I shouldn't. Anybody want to have a comment? Yes, go ahead, please. Can we have a microphone down there? I'll bring it to you. Come up here and we'll get a microphone. We're going to have 3 comments and then we're going to let Naila sing us out. Okay?
Okay. Hello? Yes. I'm going to address Naila. I'm on the board of the Egyptian Food Bank. After the crisis, we've actually put many trucks with supplies on the border on Rafah, and they were denied to get in. Now, the interesting thing, the next day, Antonio Guterres came to Rafah, and he failed to do anything. If I were him, I would have resigned on the spot. Now, this is one example. The other example, the International Court of Justice declared many are war criminals in the whole engagement. One of them is Netanyahu. Now, the guy, 3 weeks later on, he was on a visit in New York, and he was greeted at the Congress. The issue is not money, it's not collecting money. And if you want to collect money, you have to collect it to put pressure to change, because the current governance system, the UN, is failing. Full stop. If you're going to collect money or refuse money, that's going to be a local thing that you do. You're going to be playing on your own sandbox. You'll have to have a way of reaching globally, maybe even to the American public, and show them what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Hadi Yakubu from Africans Rising, an African citizen based in Ghana. My question is for philanthropies and funders. Where do you get your money from? And I'm asking that because we're talking about global governance and changing systems and all. There's an underlying system that makes all this governance so appalling for all of us. And we need to be aware if some of the ways in which the money from the philanthropy is also investing in propping up those systems, or actually de-investing and making those systems unsustainable on themselves. That way we can have a sustainable way forward. But if the money is, the source of the money itself is going towards making these systems of oppression and global malgovernance and misalignment stronger, then we would have a long way to go. The second and last is that we've, coming from a movement background, we've known many activists and movements. People live there and then they enter the philanthropy spaces and their voices get muted. So all the issues about Palestine and all these, the hypocrisy and all of that, they have voices that they could talk about it. They could even make changes within, but they fear for their jobs. So the question I want to ask is, how do we, from movements and funders, also create a mutual solidarity amongst ourselves so that it doesn't look like we as movements are only looking for money to come. We also have voices that we can help those within who seek changes from within the funding agencies. How do we create that mutual solidarity so that we can also support the funders? Thank you.
Hi, Leila Hassini, independent advisor. Thank you so much to all the speakers. Naila, thank you so much for your session. Thanks for talking about how individually we need to decolonize and beginning at the individual level. I also appreciated your 3 commitments that you made, and I would encourage us as a conference to think about the commitments that we're all making before we leave and hold ourselves accountable to those. I would like to know from you what you think are 3 commitments that we could collectively make to start making some of the shifts from moving from funders who are not serving us and who are defunding us to actually moving towards a more common aligned strategy around how we create a philanthropic ecosystem that serves us and that's different. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question, and then we're going to Naila, and she's not going to answer all the questions.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Naila, for that powerful address. My question relates to the question you, Gerry, asked to Marlon about decolonizing African philanthropy. Of course, Moira Fall from the Geneva Graduate Institute, but Harare girl, very happy to be home. My question is, of course, there's a huge amount of African philanthropy that really is coming from African roots. And then also there's other types of philanthropy that have been learned, as you said, Ewelina, in what you said. What we can't forget is we're not just talking about decolonizing philanthropy. Coloniality, which is the ongoing effects of colonialization, shapes every single part of the social air that we breathe, the society in which we live, what we're allowed to think and act, if we stay within those boundaries. And really sort of tells us what it is that we're supposed to want, what it is that we're supposed to want out of our world. So there's something about what philanthropy can do to decolonize coloniality, which I think is important. Thank you.
Very useful. Thank you. Now you can let me have it.
Were you over me? I'm not going to talk too much. I'll just say. So when you addressed Marlon about the decolonization and sort of the concept around decolonization, you reminded me of something which is part of this realization as well, and the epiphanies that I've come to over the last couple of months, maybe the last year or so. So, fun fact, the first ever recorded act of philanthropy was recorded on this continent by a woman in Morocco, Fatima Al-Fihri, and it was the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, which is a functioning university to this day, right? And it was in the form of a waqf, which is an endowment. And this was in 859, I think. So it's always interesting for me when people try to come to our parts of the world and talk to us about teaching us about philanthropy, because I think that's kind of cute, given that we pretty much invented the concept. join us. But anyway, so that's interesting that you brought it up in that way. But it also made me reflect on. I mean, I've been using the term around the decolonization of, and getting on board with shifting power and. No, so it just made me reflect a little bit on within the context of what you're saying. So obviously, I don't think I mean it in that way. But for me, it really is about just sort of deconstructing a lot of these notions that have been imposed on us. And then taking ownership and allowing ourselves the agency to be able to reconfigure these systems that have been kind of imposed on us and brought to us from places that may not necessarily share similar values, similar cultural context, etc. And to Layla's point, first of all, Layla and Halima, I love you guys so much. Thank you for everything, honestly. And to the guy, whoever it is in the back who was screaming River to the Sea and made me cry, I love you, and I'm going to need to give you a hug later. But yeah. So the commitments that I would love, first of all, I'd love really for all of us to just act like grown-ups and just start speaking and saying these things out loud and talking about the things that we need to say without embarrassment and without apology, because honestly, it's our time, seriously. Like, let's just, let's claim it. So I'd love to see that. I'd really love for you guys to come up to me at some point and kind of tell me how we can help each other. I've already made my commitments. I swear to God, I'm 100% sure my team is going to kill me when they see this talk. Because I say yes to everything. And then I add extra things. But I honestly think I don't know any other way that we're going to change the world, right? I really don't know that there's another way to do this. So those are two things that I could ask of you. And then third, make the same spaces for your peers. We should not be fighting for these resources. I met someone yesterday, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but I met someone yesterday or the day before yesterday, who was talking about how they had spent 3 years putting together this incredibly powerful grant proposal for money that was pretty much earmarked, a couple of $1 million to a donor who, once the government of that country changed, just backed out. And so anyway, I instantly said to this person, tell me exactly what it is that you need and how you need to do it, and I will find a way to help you. And I'm not even trying to be like, altruistic. I'm literally thinking, there are mechanisms in my network. I am registered in the US because I have to be, because it's impossible to be registered in the Arab region and do anything meaningful when it comes to the kind of work that I'm trying to do. So I'm registered in the US. I can be a fiscal sponsor. I can accept money on your behalf. I can take some of the money that I've been so fortunate to get from donors who have given me, core support, unrestricted funding. My God, how hard is that? And share it, because I just can't, I don't want to be doing this by myself. And I would hope that people would, reciprocate that kind of, collaboration.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you. This is really probably something we could all need to reflect on. Sorry. I think we're going to all have to reflect on some of the things that we've heard. I think holding each other's feet to the fire is a prerequisite, and this is the group that can do it, right? This audience, the African Philanthropy Forum, the African Philanthropy Network, are good at speaking truth to power, not sloganeering, and holding each other accountable. We're actually I've seen that happen, and so I think this is a very encouraging space to talk about holding each other's feet to the fire and saying, don't use that concept and don't use that notion because it's demeaning, it takes away people's agency. And I think it's really important that we recognize on this continent, above all other continents, because of what it has been through in terms of colonialism, that there is agency on the continent, and that agency was never expunged. And this is the absolute proof of that. So the resurgence of African philanthropy is, for me, a signal that Africa is finding itself after a very dark period of a lot of people with all sorts of different agendas. And I think calling people on when those agendas surface. I was the chair of the Global Fund for Community Foundations when the meeting took place in Johannesburg, and we invented this notion of shift the power. And shift the power has become a slogan. I now divide the people who use the words shift the power just rhetorically from the ones who really mean it and who understand how difficult shifting the power is going to be. So we invent slogans all the time and need to hold each other accountable. Thank you for being such an attentive audience. Thank you, Naila, for being so gentle with us. And thank you all the panelists for your contributions. Thank you very much.